So here's what we're going to do today. Actually, I'm going to switch the view in just a couple of moments. I just wanted to give you a couple of quick slides to make some points and kind of set the tone for what we're going to talk about. And then when Srini and I start our conversation, we'll just flip over to the video chat so that you can see us a little bit better. And again, I want to thank you for your resilience and patience as we test out this new system so that we can have these conversations with you all live. So as I mentioned in the description, this is a topic that's been coming up a lot for me in the stress mastery program that I teach, as well as the live workshops and just different conversations I've been having with people, is our political environment and how to stay resilient and try to stay calm so that we can really collaborate with other people. And I wanted to just kind of quickly go over a couple of framework things, and then we'll invite Srini in to have a discussion around this. The first thing is that when we think about stress, one of the ways I like to encourage people to think about this is an energetic experience when demand is greater than capacity. So essentially, you can look at this occurring for different reasons. Either there's too much demand on your time, energy, resources, or you don't have the capacity to cope with whatever the demands may be. So sometimes we want to minimize demand. Sometimes we want to improve or maximize capacity. A lot of times it's a little bit of both. Well, what's happening right now for a lot of people, I kind of see it boiling down into three things, and we'll go over this with Dr. Pillay as well. Really, control being a big piece of that. Obviously, when we minimize them or we can make change to those, it's a lot easier to deal with the energy of stress. But when we feel like things are happening to us or they're outside of our control, that's one of the primary triggers for the stress response that becomes chronic and negative. The other thing is the rate of change happening really quickly, so we don't have time to feel like we can adapt or even process what's going on. And then I feel like just in our world today, just the lack of calm. We just don't have a lot of places we can go to be still and get into a quiet place where we can process everything that's happening. And so, Srini, I'm going to go ahead and switch this over to just kind of a chat view here, and hopefully people will be able to see you a little bit better. And I'm curious your thoughts on this, kind of thinking about that framework, and you and I have had so many discussions around this. Maybe we could start with that element of control and the impact that has on the brain and our experience of stress.
Yeah, so one of the things I like to start with generally is that the brain is a resource constrained but dynamically configured environment. And what that means is that it only can take so much focus or so much of sort of attentional strain, but we can change the brain if we want to manage our stress more effectively. So, given that that's the case, the metaphor I like to use is attentional units. So let's say we have 20 units of attention. If 18 units are taken up by political events, you've got 2 units left to manage your stress and to manage what's going on in general. And so one of the first things we have to talk about is how do we release more units of attention so we can pay attention to ourselves, pay attention to the other things in our lives, and simultaneously help ourselves deal with the political situation. Now, people I talk to who are consumed by this say, how can you not pay attention to it? If you have to pay attention, I'm afraid, I'm petrified. What I generally say is, it's a matter of philosophy. Like, I think that there are enough miserable things happening in the world that you can occupy all 20 attentional units in 2.5 seconds. You just have to look at the number of people who are dying of AIDS in Africa. You have to just look at what's going on in the political situation, terrorism. I mean, you can take up all of your units. So the reality is that the situation of the world is to a large extent dependent on what you choose to pay attention to. And in the same way that there are a lot of horrible and miserable things happening, there are also pretty amazing things happening. Like the eclipse of the sun, like the beautiful morning when you get up, like people that you may love, like a delicious meal that you have. And so one of my first things is a very simple intervention is to address our own addiction to the news. So if you turn on the news at any point in time, no matter which side of this debate you're on, and no matter how you think about the presidency, if you turn on the news, you're going to be consumed by some kind of polarized idea, right? Someone's going to say something good's happening, and someone's going to say something's bad happen, something bad's happening. And I think you just have to decide how many days a week you want to catch up with with the latest political changes, and determine that your life and your attention is more important to conserve than just addictively consuming information from the news. Because
Right.
the
So I think that that's an
sensation,
important point. I just want to go back and just kind of make sure everybody's connecting to that idea of attentional units are limited. And so if we're not careful, we can get pulled by our fear response into obsessively being addicted to all of those units getting spent on negativity and fear and essentially getting stuck in that hijacked mode, not being able to do anything about it.
absolutely. So that would be the first thing. The second thing, which I think is interesting, is that sometimes you speak to people and they say, I just don't care about things anymore because of the rate of change and the rate of what's going on. People just don't feel a sense of caring. Now, in order to feel a sense of caring, you do need to have your emotional resources protected in the brain. But in addition to that, you need to have elements of your thinking brain, your prefrontal cortex, available to care. Now, studies have shown, as I pointed out in my new book, Tinker Dabble Doodle Try, that focus really eats up a lot of brain energy. And so if you spend your whole day just focusing, let me get up, let me make the food, let me go to work, let me figure out when to pick the kids up, let me come back home, let me go to this class, let me go to this gym. Even if you don't have those components in, if you just go from one thing to another, the reality is that focus eats up brain energy, and one study actually showed the fact that depletion of the prefrontal cortex makes the heart grow less fond of anything. You start to care less about everything.
Right.
And so it starts to impact your life. So you really want to manage not just your time, but your brain energy. And you
And
want
I
to
want to
make
say to
that.
that too, that makes sense from a survival perspective that the brain's trying to conserve resources. So if we are paying that much attentional energy to fear and trauma and change and chaos, that it's just trying to help us by pulling energy from that prefrontal cortex and kind of disassociating. So it's a protection mechanism gone wrong in some ways.
That's right, and I think we can correct that. I think one of the ways we can correct that, as you were implying, is by recognizing what we are in control of and what we wish to control. Because I think the moment you turn the news on, you're like, oh my God, I can't believe there's this new policy. Oh my God, I can't believe that this opinion was expressed. And the reality is, oh my God, look at the stock market, it's plummeting. I just put my money into it. Now, you have to decide what things in your life are worth controlling and what things are not. Now, I'm not saying don't care about the news or only care about it if you are going to be actively participating in it. But I am saying that we can let go of the things we can't control and actually start introducing a few more control elements to help ourselves feel a greater sense of agency. Because I think part of the terror of the political landscapes in a lot of countries these days actually is that you feel like you're not in control of what's happening and what's being said and the policies that are coming out. And so part of what you want to say to yourself is, well, I, nobody wants to feel like they're down a slippery slope for the rest of their lives, right? I mean, it's not a pleasant feeling. Uncertainty actually activates the complex center in the brain and the gut detector, and it actually makes you feel like the sky is falling down. It distorts brain activity. So, what you want to actually do is correct to neutral and say, okay, I heard that. What are three things I can feel in control of? You can all the way from feeding the dog to finishing the assignment at work to feeling like you can go for a massage or go to dinner with friends. These are things you can't control. And I think too often we just let our whole days slip away from us without recognizing that we can be in control of this.
Yeah, that's
I think at a
beautiful.
much deeper level, there's a really important psychological framework that comes from psychodynamic psychiatry that I think is controversial, but I think it's interesting. So there's a school of therapy in psychodynamic therapy that says that essentially external reality, concentrating on external reality, is a defense against exploring your psychic infrastructure.
Sure.
And that in reality, when we over attend to external events, we are avoiding addressing our own chaos. So a
Yeah.
lot of times people pay attention to this kind of chaos outside because they were internally chaotic anyway, and this chaos is reflecting what they are inside. So although it's counterintuitive, I think a lot of people would say we need to go back inside our minds and realign our priorities and realign our motivations so that we feel more in control and not let ourselves be led in a leash by this political environment. And that means
Yes.
spending a
Yeah.
lot more internal time.
Right. Well, I want to go back just for a second because a lot of the questions that I'm getting are also around like, could this make me physically sick? Like I have people who are physically sick and they're experiencing that. And obviously we know the research is very clear that the stress response, when it's not mobilized, when we're not taking action in some way, turns on us and does become toxic and does absolutely cause anything that's already wrong in our system to get worse and malfunction. So for those of you who are wondering, could stress cause these issues? Absolutely, it's going to manifest in that way if you're feeling that debilitating, paralyzed analysis paralysis, overwhelm. And I think what's so beautiful about what you're saying is being responsible, knowing we only have so much attention and we can be in control of our own mind with regards to how much attention we spend on which things, and that the switch then happens when we look for things we can control. So knowing that we have a list of all these things that are out of our control, if we just focus on that, the brain gets hijacked, overwhelmed. But if we say yes, and here are the things I can control, here are the things that are positive, we're not ignoring or minimizing what's negative, but we're channeling that energy and channeling even that stress to use it for positive outcome. And I think if there's nothing else that comes out of this conversation, I really want to leave people, again, not feeling like we're trying to put a band-aid on a problem, but that collectively, if we start looking at things we can control, looking at things we can impact, and finding the beauty that's still there in the midst of all of the darkness, that we can have collaboration and potentially positive change, even in the midst of this chaos. So for those of you who are hanging on, wanting to ask your questions, I just want to let you know in just a few minutes we are going to switch back over so we can see your chat. So if you do have questions, go ahead and type those in the chat box and we'll spend the last 10 minutes or so answering some of those questions. So Srini, what are your, knowing we've got a couple of minutes left, you mentioned kind of taking control or letting go of what you can't control and then taking control of the things you can. What's your kind of quick go-to plan for somebody who's ready to take action on that?
So I think the very first thing is to have a regular practice of some kind of meditation, whether it
Sure.
involves meditating while walking, mindfulness meditation, transcendental meditation, setting aside ideally 20 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes in the evening, starting out with 5 minutes at each time, will help
Yeah.
to calm down your brain and let the fear center of your brain be less reactive. I think number two, try to ask, remember that the dysregulation you feel is because of the uncertainty. And
Mhm.
so you want to really correct to neutral, remembering that there's a brain bias. So use self-talk and say to yourself, look, you are feeling like the sky is falling down, but that's because your brain is biased. And
Right.
so what you want to do is remember, we don't know the consequences, but we can follow this to try to understand it. Because the brain goes into panic mode and into catastrophic mode, and we want to use self-talk to correct back to neutral. That's not to say the situation's great or that it's not dire. It is to say that if you are going to interact in that situation, no one else is going to actually care about your brain. You need the brain resources, which is why we're recommending that you make these changes. So that would be the second thing. I think the third thing is control feedback. So the amount of information we get from the world on a day-to-day basis is just too overwhelming. And I
Right.
would just say limit your exposure to news, limit your exposure to social media, and decide not to be addicted. Because a lot of social media, for example, is structured specifically so you keep on coming back. And I think you want to pay attention to the stuff that matters, but at the same time, control what that is. And I think the fourth thing is use self-talk to realistically recognize am I really going to control this policy? If so, what can I do? Can I send a local letter? Give yourself some kind of agency around the fact that you can express yourself. And if you can't control it, then say, this time I'm going to let this go. Because it's about 100 things to worry about. How about I choose the two or three things that I actually care about that I'm going to do something about? And I
Yeah.
think when it comes to change, remember that any kind of change that's going on is sort of anxiety provoking. And that in order to remain calm, we really want to be able to remember certain things are actually going to go away. Like, no matter how you think about it, and no matter what you think about any political situation, everybody serves a certain term, and then there's a chance to reconsider what that is. So
Yeah.
remember that although things feel like they are lasting forever, they're probably not going to last forever. And so I think this is not to say don't care now or think or try to make everything sound great. It's simply to say you matter, your brain matters, and your energy matters. And to the extent that you can manage your own energy, you'll be able to be much more constructive when you have objections and much more caring about yourself and others if you have the time and energy to care.
Beautiful. Well, that's just, it's so perfectly put, as always. I love everything that you say, and very practical. And really, the whole point of this program, the idea of being the boss of your own brain, is that you can really pay attention. You can be intentional. And I just want to emphasize a couple of things that you said that have been so powerful for me. Number one is those 20 minutes. I mean, I was doing 5, 7, 10-minute mini meditations for years. And just within the last few weeks, I've been dedicated to 20 minutes twice a day. And it has changed my life. It is
Yeah.
reprogramming your nervous system to be more comfortable in that state of calm, even when things are chaotic around you. So I can't emphasize that enough. And we're going to be doing an upcoming program on meditation. What is it? What are the different types? What are the pros and cons? There's actually not a lot of cons, but what are the pros compared to each other? And then the other piece I've heard you say before, and we're going to switch over to chat here next, even saying your own name and some of the self-talk and that correction. And I think that that's really fascinating because we do have these involuntary thoughts sometimes, just like we have our heart beating involuntarily. And sometimes it's not really aligned with who we are. And so when we can catch ourselves, whether you call yourself by name, I like to call mine a monkey. I don't know, I feel like there goes my monkey mind. But even if you just kind of say, Heidi, this is not how you feel, or Heidi, I know you've actually looked at some research or something, you've talked about that before. When you say your own name, there's a bit of a kind of a shock factor that I think really gets the brain to pay attention. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, and it's also a distancing, right? Because when you're in your anxiety, you feel like you are your anxiety. But if you say,
Right.
Heidi or Srini, like you need to do something, studies show that it can improve your confidence and decrease your stress.
Cool. Okay. Well, for those of you who are on with live, I do want to take your questions. And so if you have a question or comment that you would like to post, you can go ahead and send that in the chat box. And let's see if people don't have questions. Okay, I see some people typing as they say, I have plenty of questions on this topic. Trying to think let's give this a moment and see if anyone has any questions in the group. We talked about meditation, Srini, and you mentioned a couple. Maybe you could share with us, is there a particular style of meditation that you practice personally? And then I've got a question here for you after that.
Yeah, the type of meditation that I practice is transcendental meditation, which I think has the second most amount of data scientifically backing it
Mhm.
up. I do it because my brother actually told me to do it when I was in medical school. I told him it sounded like nonsense. He said, if you're a real scientist, try it out and see if it works.
Sure.
And I said, sure, I'll try it out. I tried it out, changed my life, and I said, well, I don't know if this is going to work for everybody, but for whatever reason, it seems to be working for me. And I'm not as regular as I'd like to be, but when I am, which is 20 minutes twice a day, in ways that I cannot determine, my life seems to be much better. And when I'm less regular, I feel like things get a little bit more chaotic. That said,
Yeah.
I think the type of meditation that has the most data backing it up is mindfulness meditation, which is simply placing your attention on your breath and watching that narrative and not getting engaged in that narrative. For those of you who are like, I'm just not going to sit still for 20 minutes, there are walking meditations, there are loving meditation, loving kindness meditations. And I noticed one of the questions was, can you address
Yeah,
self-love?
perfect. I was just going to bring that up, and I was going to mention self-compassion meditation. So again, we'll do our next webinar, our next Brain Boss webinar on the different types of meditation. So we will talk about transcendental mindfulness and other practices. So I think this is a great question from Anne, is with regards to self-love, self-responsibility on this topic. And I think, one of the things that came to mind for me, even as you were talking, is that we have to take that personal responsibility for the energy we bring when we show up and doing these sorts of practices. At the same time, we don't want to get caught judging ourselves, beating ourselves up, the whole self-critic, which is why I think self-compassion practices are really helpful. So what are your thoughts on that, Srini?
I think that I think it's a tricky one, and the reason I think it's a tricky one is that I think it's difficult to get up every morning, look at yourself in the mirror, and want to be kissing yourself. It's just sort of like it's not. It's as much as it would be ideal. Most people don't get up in the morning thinking like, you rock, like, I love you, and that's cool if you can do that. I have a slightly more philosophical take on this, which is that there is an observing ego, an observing voice, the voice that critiques us, our editor, and an experiencing self. And when we are constantly observing ourselves and experiencing ourselves, there can be no love. It's a dualistic framework in which we are fragmented and we are split. When you think about self-love, most people will report it in a state that feels like a flow state, in which the observing self and the experiencing self come together, and you get this non-dualistic representation of who you are as you move through the world. And so my definition of self-love is a non-dualistic state in which you are both the observer and the experiencer simultaneously,
Mm.
so that there is no critic because there are no two parts. And you may ask, well, that sounds great, but how do I actually get to do this? I think that this state happens through a couple of different ways. Firstly, meditation can help you understand how to simply be. Secondly, by placing your attention on what is before you, you actually lose, and becoming engaged with it, you actually lose this kind of inner critic. And the third thing is sport is a fantastic way to lose this kind of observing and experiencing self, because when you're in the game, you're in the game. And then the fourth thing, which may be counterintuitive, is things like video games can help you lose this kind of observing and experiencing self. So I think that those are some of the ways in which we can develop self-love and self-compassion. I think the idea of criticizing ourselves is something that we need to think about deeply, because I think we want to improve. So we want to recognize when we're not happy with who we are. But at the same time, we want to recognize that we're human and that we're wired in this really weird way. And we can't really make immediate changes all of the time. So my excuse I mean, there are probably like, I don't even think I could stop counting the number of things that I'm messing up right now. So if I think about them, there's so many of those things. But I like to think of a phrase that I use, which is cracked but not broken, the art of human vulnerability. And I think the extent to which we can remain vulnerable and the extent to which we can not know and give ourselves permission to not know so we can be curious and find out. I see life as just continuous learning with the rest in between. And that's what I would recommend that most people do.
Great. So I want to say to everyone who's watching, because this goes back to Srini's book, his newest book, Tinker, Dabble, Doodle, Try, is about the power of the unfocused mind. And so you bring up something really interesting here, which is I think sometimes we can over-focus on self-love, like we have to convince ourselves to love ourselves, and in that we start judging our whole process, when sometimes we just need to get out of our own head. So looking at, how do we tinker, how do we play, how do we relax, how do we use humor, curiosity, instead of thinking about, eliminating the critic, we just, in some ways, we quiet it by doing other activities or really focusing on gratitude and appreciation. The other thing I was thinking about is this idea of empathy and being able to kind of show self-compassion with ourselves through some of those self-compassion meditations, but also in our actions. So I would really encourage those of you who are thinking about this that if you were going to show true compassion for another person, you wouldn't just try to talk about it, you would show it, you would demonstrate it. And so, another great way to show self love is to actually take care of yourself. So, to actually eat healthier foods or get some exercise or spend time outside or get a massage, anything you can do that's nourishing for yourself. And during a time of great chaos and a lot of change, I can't really think of any better way to shift your state of being, which is really going to help settle the primal parts of the brain, than doing those sorts of nurturing activities. Or even things like, I remember going through a difficult time, Srini, and like the first thing I wanted to do was watch a funny movie in bed at like 6 o'clock in the morning. And I remember thinking, why can't I watch a funny movie in bed at 6 o'clock in the morning if I want to? And there was something about just giving myself permission to do these things that were outside of the box that started to shift my nervous system. So my first thought wasn't rushing and I have to ignore the news and I don't want to get pulled into all these things. It was just doing something actively to move me into a different state. So that I think really worked for me and maybe provide some other ideas for people who are out there. So, I think the main thing to think about with this and why I talked about this session is being not just politics, but anytime we're in an environment that feels out of control or feels like there's a lot of change happening, is to really think more about how we be the boss of our brain. And we do that by being intentional about our attention. I love what you said, Srini, about these attentional units and essentially thinking about how we budget that. That yes, you can spend some time focusing on the news and staying updated on, the chaos that is in the world around us, but make sure you don't spend all of your energy doing that, or that's when you're going to feel really stuck. Make sure you intentionally spend time as well looking for the positive. And I think there's always examples of positive things and positive people, even in difficult times. So let me just turn it back over to you, Srini. Any closing comments that you want to make or thoughts about additional resources?
I think the one thing I want to say is we mentioned a couple of different things. We mentioned refocusing on positive things. We mentioned reframing things so that you correct to neutral. We mentioned doing a deeper self-examination. We mentioned meditation. These are a lot of different things. And I think people get frustrated when their lives don't change immediately. But I will say that you really need to make stress understanding a very important priority in your life because there are ways in which it can help you and there are ways in which it can hurt you. And to the extent that we know both of those things, how it helps and how it hurts, we can really move our lives forward. The other thing I would say, which is something I realized recently only, because I suddenly realized that this whole thing about exercising more and more physical exercise, like just adding a couple more hours for aerobics and a couple more hours for, 10 or 30, it just wasn't going to cut it. I suddenly realized that I need to do much more mobility work. I need to do much more stretching, and I need to do much more movement. And that means that my schedule had to change. And I work really hard. I work a lot of hours a day. I love my work, so I sort of feel like I'm thrown into it. And even when I hate the thought of what I'm going to work in, because my nature is to get engaged, I get engaged in it, and then I sort of feel like, I'm totally lost in it. The one big thing I want to say to everyone is take a look at your schedule and make it a rule to change that schedule for the kinds of techniques we're talking about. If you don't build in a deliberate time for walking, you will not find the time to walk.
That's right.
If you don't build in a deliberate time for stretching, you will not find the time to stretch. If you don't build in a deliberate time for these contemplations, you will not. And although the temptation will be to say, I have no time, I've got to get stuff done, you will really be working much more efficiently if you change the structure of your life. So before we talk about any of these techniques, I would say go back to your calendar and just try to block off periods of time. As you know, I have this Tinker table, which people can get, where you can actually just say, okay, Monday, I'm spending 1 hour doing this, broken up into 4 15-minute segments, when I'm going to have a slump in my day anyway. And if you really address the structure of your life, then the function will follow. But these techniques are not going to come out of nowhere if you don't build a structure into your life. And I think that's a really big realization that all of us should take away.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And speaking of time, we're out of it. And I promise to hold that space and that time sacred for everybody. So I will post some links to some of the things that we've mentioned, including Srini's book, and you can find out more about the Tinker Table. I would really encourage you right now to close this webinar, get your calendar in front of you, figure out when you're going to spend at least 20 minutes every day. I would encourage 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes midday somewhere, but really start plugging that time in. Then we can play around with the techniques to use and the strategies. But the time is not magically going to show up, and just making that commitment to yourself is going to help you to feel like you have the capacity to cope with the challenges in your life. And essentially, that's what I believe. Stress is just information that helps us to see where we need to make those adjustments. And if we use it appropriately, we can actually use it to fuel positive change. So thank you all so much for being here with us. We appreciate you. We look forward to seeing you again. And I will definitely have Srini back on this program very, very soon. Srini, thank you so much for sharing your time and your energy with us.
Thanks for having me, Heidi, and thanks everyone just for being here and for participating in this conversation and this energy. Really appreciate
Amazing.
it.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.